Welcome to the Darkstream, VoxDay, voxday.net, and unauthorized.tv. Thanks for tuning in. Been a bit of a busy night, bit more excitement than one would like, but there we are. So anyhow, long and short of it is, on the international scene, there's some big news in that Ukraine offered a ceasefire, or accepted Trump's idea for a ceasefire. And as I expected, the Russians promptly rejected it. And it's really not a big mystery as to why. And someone posted a link to what I think was a very informative anticipation of what was in fact the Russian response. So this is the short history of Ukrainian peace negotiations. Thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are killed in the Ilovaisk encirclement in 2014. We're ready for peace, let's negotiate. Minsk 1 is concluded, and the Ukrainians immediately break it. Then, in 2015, thousands of Ukrainian soldiers are killed in the Debaltsevo encirclement. Stop the war. We want peace. Minsk 2 is concluded, and they break it immediately, and afterwards openly state that they never even intended to honor it. And in fact, that was confirmed by Angela Merkel, among others, who said the whole reason that they concluded that Minsk 2 agreement was to buy Ukraine more time to be rearmed by NATO. It's kind of remarkable that the Russians are even potentially willing to talk to them. There's also one more thing that they don't mention here, is that in 2022, but I think before the special military operation began, or Russian invasion, however you prefer to describe it, Zelensky was ready to sign some sort of peace deal in Turkey, and maybe somebody who's watching can remind us of when exactly that was. And that's when Boris Johnson flew in and said, no, you don't need to do this. NATO will have your back, we'll help you fight, we'll provide you with material, we'll provide you with soldiers, etc., etc. And that's what has extended this war. If Ukraine had been left to its own devices, had been fighting by itself, the war would have been over in a few weeks, as I and other military, students of military history anticipated. What people don't realize is that Russia has essentially defeated 3 separate armies. It hasn't just been, against Ukraine. Then in 2022, this one was new to me. I didn't realize this one. Russian troops were outside Kiev in 2022. Ukraine said that they were ready for negotiations. A peace deal is signed, then they shoot their own negotiator in the head and break the peace immediately. It's possible that this is the same peace deal that we're talking about with regards to Turkey, because I seem to remember there not being a good outcome for the Ukrainian negotiator. So maybe that is the one that we were talking about with regards to Turkey and Boris Johnson. And then what just happened that would potentially have made the Ukrainians more open to a ceasefire? Well, number one, you have the pressure from the U.S. The U.S. has been turning on and off the intelligence and slow rolling its delivery of money and supplies and that sort of thing. And then on top of that, the Ukrainian army suffers a collapse in the Kursk Oblast. I don't think that that is really significant. I mean, the Kursk incursion was always doomed. I mean, it was essentially the Ukrainian attempt to recreate a Battle of the Bulge situation and then have a negotiating card. But it was always worthless as a negotiating card because the Russians always had the ability to push them right out, as they have in fact done, without really utilizing any frontline troops. You know, part of the idea of the incursion was that Ukraine would send its best forces into Russia, into that Kursk pocket, or as it were, and that would force Russia to take some of its best troops off of take the pressure off. You know, the best defense being a good offense, I suppose, being the idea. The problem is, it didn't work. Russia just said, you know what? You want to hang on to that land for a while, a couple hundred square kilometers? Go ahead. And the troops that actually drove them out are the Chechen National Guard. There's it's not the top Chechen guy, but one of his lieutenants who was kind of on the outs with him for a while, but proved loyal, is back in, and he's been commanding the efforts there. And you know, they're not even using the frontline Russian troops there. So the Ukrainian strategy, such as it was a complete failure from the very beginning. And so when you look at how that went, I mean, since it was always doomed, I don't think that the final collapse is enough to provoke the ceasefire offer. What I think is more likely that provoked it is there have been numerous rumors for the past 4 days that the Russians have crossed the Dnieper River in several locations. And the problem for Ukraine there is that there doesn't appear to be any fortifications behind the river. And so, and there aren't any cities. It's basically prairie. You know, that's tank country. You know, you can't dig in and hide from anything on the Ukrainian equivalent of the Great Plains. And so my suspicion is that crossing the Dnipro was actually what prompted this latest ceasefire effort. Now, we don't have direct confirmation of that, but if I'm correct, you know, we'll see Simplicius and others, Martinov, confirming that in fairly short order. Now, of course, the Russians did not accept the ceasefire, nor would it have made any sense for them to do so, because, of course, what's in it for them? You know, all they'll do is give Ukraine more time to shuffle its remaining pieces around, you know, cost more, get their defenses set, and cost more Russian lives. And so I suspect that the Russians are at some point in time going to demand an unconditional surrender. That's probably what they should do. You know, the Ukrainians have had, and NATO have had 2.5 years to agree to Russia's terms, and they never have. And so there's not really any point in negotiating. There's not really any point in discussing anything, because neither NATO nor the Kiev regime is what one can reasonably describe as a reasonable party. You know, in the case of World War II, the Japanese were reasonable. You know, they'd been making surrender overtures for months. they wanted to surrender sooner rather than later because they didn't want to fight the Soviets. And there were actually some pretty massive battles. Zhukov was actually leading some large battles over on the eastern side of Russia, and into Manchuria and that sort of thing. And there were some very large battles, cost tens of thousands of Japanese lives that could have been spared, and they probably would have been able to hang on to more territory as well. But the U.S. was not willing to do that. Would unconditional affect our minerals? Well, no, it wouldn't, because most of those minerals that Trump was supposedly negotiating for are already in the territory held by Russia. And Russia's made it very clear that all of those 4 provinces, plus the Crimea, and I suspect, I'd be very surprised if they didn't also demand Odessa, and if they didn't demand some kind of something with regards to Transnistria, because there are a number of Russians there that would be facing potential problems if there's not some sort of rearrangement or realignment in that area. So, Europe is in complete disarray. A ruling just came down from the Supreme Court of Romania saying that the guy who won the 2 presidential elections so far and was looking like he was going to win the runoff and become the next Romanian president would not be permitted to run. So, and Romania is an EU country. It's not one of the leaders of the EU, but it is an EU country. And so seeing an EU country just blatantly throw away its democracy there is significant, especially when we know all the shenanigans going on in Germany, the shenanigans going on in France. Silent Draco says all of Nova Russia is belong to us. Yeah, there's absolutely no reason not for them to. Sam Perchansky says, how can the Russians trust anything the US or Europe says? No choice but to push to Lvov. Lvov is like the city on the westernmost point of Ukraine. I don't think that they need to do that. The way that the Russians can trust what the US says is if the US withdraws from NATO. If the US withdraws from NATO, it is demonstrating that the equation has completely changed, and there's a new game in town. Also, obviously, the U.S. should drop the sanctions, return the seized funds, etc., etc. Those are the 2 things that the U.S. has to do. And it's possible that Russia would accept the U.S. continuing to stay in NATO. I don't, if I were in their position, I would not, but that may, for some Russian strategists, that may be regarded as one row too far to hoe. But the way that the Europeans are behaving, they seem to believe that the U.S. is going to pull out of NATO sooner or later. And a lot of what they're saying is nonsense. This whole, we're going to spend $800 billion on defense. No, they're not. That money doesn't exist, and it's nonsense for them to say it. And even if they did, what are they going to spend it on? Money is not defense. Buying expensive toilets will not accomplish anything. Any chance Russia would want U.S. to stay in NATO so EU won't rearm? No, I don't believe so. Ironic Keyboard says correctly, they'd be doing the U.S. a favor by pushing them out of NATO. No question. Absolutely no question. No, and obviously, it would probably be very beneficial for a lot of the nations of Europe if the US would actually defend democracy and use its troops that are there to force the Europeans to stop doing what they're doing. But that's not really the US's business. That's, that's the kind of globalism that got the US into trouble in the first place. So the best thing to do the best thing for the God Emperor to do is to announce that we're leaving NATO, and the troops are coming home, and good luck. Why would a country like NATO, like Norway, join NATO but not the EU? Well, it's very simple. Norway is very oil rich, and it's very wealthy. And if they join the EU is going to take a lot of that oil wealth away from them and redistribute it to Romania and Poland and everybody else. They join NATO because they're, very, very credulous, and they genuinely believe that Russia wants to invade all of Europe. Now, I don't understand. I mean, I can to a certain extent understand where the Finns are coming from. They actually fought a war with the Soviet Union. The Soviets actually did invade Finland. I can see why the Finns are more on edge about Russia than other countries are justified being. Poland, you can understand why the Poles are pessimistic about Russia. The thing I don't understand is why they're not more dubious and skeptical of the EU and of Germany. I mean, somebody said, let me get this straight. We're encouraging Germans to send their soldiers into Poland so they can fight Russia? I mean, that just seems insane. But the reality is, and the history is, that Russia is one of the least expansionist powers in the world. About the only significant power that is less expansionist is China. These nobody ever accused the Poles of being quick on the uptake. This is true. It's just absolutely nuts to think that the Russians want to invade the EU. What do they want from the EU? Natural resources? They've got the natural resources. Do you think that they want to deal with the migrants and stuff that the Europeans have brought in? I mean, they have no desire whatsoever to take over Europe. They've never had it. When they did take over part of Europe in response to Napoleon's invasion of Russia, they went and invaded France. They took Paris. The word bistro, the very French word bistro, is actually apparently a Russian word. And the reason it got adapted and used for the kind of cafes that it represents is because the Russian troops, and this may be apocryphal, I don't know, the Russian troops would say, quick, quick, and the word for it sounded like bistro. And so that became as a result of that invasion of 1812 or 1814, whatever it was, as a result of that occupation, it's left its lasting mark on Paris and even on the French language, supposedly. But they left. They didn't have to. The Tsar didn't want it. The Russian people didn't want it. And only China, I think, is less belligerent. The Chinese have are too superior to have any interest in anywhere on Earth that is not, the Middle Kingdom. Middle Kingdom, not referring to geography, but being halfway between heaven and earth. So, that being said, they obviously have a lot of interest in Africa's natural resources. Um, if China's going to invade anywhere, it's not going to be another Asian country. They don't want Indonesia. They don't even want Singapore. But I think the natural resources of Africa might prove pretty tempting because China is not resource rich in the same way that Russia and Africa are, and the USA. So, anyhow, that's really all I had on my mind to discuss tonight. Does anyone have any questions? We can do a sort of impromptu question day if you're interested, or since I'm tired, we could just call it a day. Also, thanks to all the backers. All the backers have of the Soul Signal project have come through. There were some payment issues because I chose the wrong option. Won't make that mistake again. But I'm gonna after we get off here, I'm gonna see about getting that stuff out either tonight or tomorrow. So I want to get all the MP3s and the FLACs out to everybody so that they can put them on their USB sticks and in their cars and on their phones, as promised. So anyhow, well, it looks like we don't have too many questions here, so we'll keep an eye on this whole thing. I think it's very interesting that Trump did manage to force the Ukrainians to accept the idea of a ceasefire. I don't think it's even remotely surprising that there won't be that the Russians won't accept it. Ironworker Bear has a question: will there be another Chuck Dixon Conan? There already is. He already wrote it. I've already read it, but we're not permitted to publish them. I made a mistake in assuming that since it's been nearly 80 something years since Robert E. Howard died, that his works were not in copyright. However, because of the bizarre way that US copyright law took form, if you had a book in that era and then renewed its copyright when it ran out in the 1950s and again in the 1970s, it's still under copyright. You end up with like something like, instead of life of the author plus 70, it worked out to like life of the author plus 99 or something. So the Conan stuff is not going to be in the public domain until 2034. So we did not have permission to do that. Fortunately, the rights holders were very reasonable and said, hey, no harm, no foul. Just please don't publish it anymore. So we haven't. We did talk to them about possibly the rights holder publishing them, but they said, yeah, we'd like to do that, and then just never got in touch with me again. So so it's possible, but probably, I'd say there's about a 35% chance that they'll agree to publish them somehow. But until then, no. Is Trump feeling any nervousness over Rob Ford's gay attempt to fight tariffs? I'm assuming you're talking about the Canadian Prime Minister, Finance Minister. I don't know who Rob Ford is, but no, there's absolutely no reason for the U.S. to be nervous about any of these countries trying to fight tariffs. The countries that are trying to fight tariffs are unfortunately foolishly believing the free trade rhetoric, which teaches that tariffs are bad for everybody. That's not true. Tariffs can be bad, but tariffs are good for you if you happen to be a country running a trade deficit. The economy literally grows by the amount of foreign exports that are kept out. Exports are imports. Other countries' exports are the US imports. M is a negative factor in GDP. If you block imports, your GDP grows right away, instantly. And so, it's not even necessarily true that tariffs block imports in the first place. We've done a calculation on our books, and we would probably have to, we would basically have $7 per book that we would have to either just take the hit, increase our prices, whatever. Either way, do you really think that that's going to have a serious effect on Castalia Library subscribers? Most of them would be happy to pay an additional $7, and we might not even have them make them do it. We might just suck it up and deal with it ourselves. We could swap the leathers, or do some. There's plenty of things that we could do and would do in order to prevent any interruption. Canada's biggest export market is the U.S. Right. I mean, I've got the calculations on the, they're right on voxday.net. We can look it up here. Not the calculation, but the totals. So if we look for Canada, okay. Oh, I see my sound turned off. So Canada, this is Canada's trade surplus was 100 billion, 3% of their GDP. So they can't win. There's literally nothing that they can do that is going to harm the US economically. And so why they're trying to do this, I have no idea. It doesn't make much sense, and it's not going to work. So, all right, well, that's all we got time for tonight. So have a good evening, and we'll look forward to seeing you at the next Darkstream.